Welcome to the Language Fuel podcast. Our mission is to fuel the teaching and learning of languages worldwide. I'm your host, Joanna Smith. Welcome to episode number 1 of the Language Fuel podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm excited to begin this journey with you. Our aim is to produce a podcast once a week, and you'll find links to the podcast as well as our blog, online courses, and online bookshop at www.languagefuel.com. Now, as this is our very first episode, today our topic is, what is the deal with Language Fuel? So I aim to answer 2 questions for you. First of all, what is Language Fuel? What's its aim? And second of all, who am I? Basically, the mission of Language Fuel is to fuel the passion of language learning and teaching worldwide. And the plan is to do this in multiple ways. So first of all, we've got the New Zealand Resource Room online store already going. I've just taken the reins recently from the previous owners, and I'm really pleased to be continuing to support language teachers this way. Now, that's predominantly a New Zealand store, but we definitely sell certainly into Australia, and we can also ship internationally if it's going to work out for you. Secondly, the goal is to create some online professional development courses for language teachers in particular to help them in whichever way that they feel they need most. Now, this is still in development mode as I'm recording. It's currently October 2016, and we are aiming to have the first set of courses available early January 2017. Thirdly, we are offering a language coaching service. Now, this is not a language teaching service, but coaching. Now, the difference is that a teacher would be a subject matter expert, so obviously would be fluent in the language in question. But a language coach is a specialist linguist and provides advice on how to go about learning whatever language it is that you're attempting to learn. And this is particularly for self-directed learners who may not have a language school or whatever, but they're using the resources available to them, including simply having a native speaker friend. So how to structure a session with a native speaker so that you can learn from it and things like that. So in order to explain that a little bit better, in one of our early episodes, I will be interviewing one of our language coaches, Leslie Foster, and you'll be able to hear from her how that works. And finally, of course, we'll be producing this podcast, which is mainly for language teachers. And the idea is really just to discuss topics that are going to help you be able to learn more and do an even more fantastic job in the classroom as you are teaching languages. So there will be some interviews. We might review some of the latest resources, both online and physical resources. The aim is to share best practice and discuss some of those hot topics. So I guess the next question is, why am I so passionate about this? Why do I care about supporting language teaching and learning? And I guess it really comes down to my own personal experience with learning different languages, which brings us to the second part of today's podcast. So my first language is English, but I learned at a very early age to adapt to different English dialects. I was born in Maryland, USA, so on the East Coast there, and I'm pretty sure I would have just learned, whatever was spoken around me. My family moved to Southern California just before I started school, so I learned a different dialect, I guess, of American English at that time, and we stayed in Southern California in Los Angeles until I was 11. At that time, we then moved to New Zealand. My parents had both been born in New Zealand, although my dad is an American citizen. So I knew about New Zealand. We had visited family in New Zealand, but this was the first time I actually lived here. So at that age where you're kind of figuring out your identity and the way you speak suddenly becomes quite important, I had a choice to make. Was I going to change my accent to sound like the Kiwis I was hanging out with at school, or was I going to keep kind of my American accent? Now, I'm pretty sure I wasn't very conscious of that choice at the time, but I do very vividly remember making the choice that I was going to fit in and I was going to pick up the New Zealand accent. So that's what I did. I got totally sick of people saying, "Ooh, say this, say that," because I sounded so different. So I made the effort to just pick up the language around me. And it wasn't until I was an adult, really, that I actually allowed some of, I guess, what I would call my mother tongue, that American accent, to come through a little bit. And so now I have a bit of a mix. I guess I'm a bit more comfortable in my own skin, but certainly I can put on the Kiwi if I want to, and I can go around a little bit. So that's my native tongue and the changes that I learned in that. Uh, at the age of about 11 or 12 at intermediate school here in New Zealand, it's compulsory to learn a language, and usually the teachers will do it for a couple of terms and then swap language. So it's just an introduction. I remember learning German for a couple of terms, and the funniest thing is that the only thing I can remember from those German classes was the young male teacher telling us a story about riding his motorbike down the Autobahn in Germany at these enormous speeds, and that he was freaked out when he was doing so and got even more freaked out when people would overtake him at even higher speeds. And that's all I remember from that language class. We also learned a little bit of French at intermediate school. And again, the only thing I remember from those French classes was that the teacher was pregnant. And she was 40 years old, and she used to wear this pin, this button on her blouse, and it had a picture of a pregnant lady, and it said, "I should have danced all night." And the reason why I remember that so vividly is that she had to explain it to the class as why that was so funny. So, yeah, we got a little bit of a life lesson there. So, needless to say, my memory of learning foreign languages as an adolescent is not particularly vivid. Then came high school, and again, it was compulsory to learn a language in the first year of high school. And the choice at the time for me was either French or Indonesian. And I chose Indonesian simply because my dad had said at the time it might be better for business purposes in the future, since Indonesia is much closer to New Zealand than France was. So that was the decision made. I do remember several things from those language classes, but again, it didn't really have much to do with the languages themselves. Mr. Flynn was our teacher, and he kept bees. And I remember one time he brought a bee into the classroom in a matchbox. He put a little bit of honey on the outside of the box, and we could watch the bee's tongue come out through the tiny little gap at the top of the box and lick the honey. Absolutely nothing to do with Indonesian language, but I was fascinated by this life lesson. I also remember feeling really safe in his class. He sat us in alphabetical order according to our surnames, and I'm sure these days people don't really do that anymore. It's probably a little bit boring to sit that way and all face the front. Nowadays, people sit in groups and do group work, but at the time, I felt very safe. I talked to the people next to me because I had no other choice. And I didn't have to be cool to find a friend to talk to. I just, sat with those people. So it was a really good classroom environment. I did learn a lot. I got good grades and that sort of thing, but I really don't remember how he taught us much of the language. Another year, I had a different Indonesian teacher, Mrs. Lowe, and what I definitely vividly remember from the actual language learning activities was a role play that I did with another girl named Michelle. And I remember one sentence that was part of our role play that we had designed, and it was this: "Kami akan ke perpustakaan," which means we're going to the library. The reason I remember that so vividly, A, probably because I was very nervous having a role play in front of the rest of the students of the class at that age, probably 13 or 14, but secondly, we worked a long time to figure out that we had to say kami for the pronoun, which is we in English, instead of kita, which also translates to we in English. But the difference between kita and kami is whether or not the listener is included in that we. And in our role play, it was, girls telling their mum that they were going off to the library. So we had to choose kami, and we were so proud of ourselves for working it out. And I've never forgotten it. Never ever, and this is a couple of decades later. Another thing I remember about learning Indonesian in high school is the school trip to Indonesia when I was 15 years old. definitely a full immersion experience. We stayed with local families, we traveled around a bit, we felt the heat, we heard the people speaking, we saw their lifestyles and their shopping centers and the stalls on the side of the road and all of that. And so that was a very, very powerful experience, certainly for 3 weeks. I remember feeling homesick. I remember eating strange food, being hot and sweaty. I've got lots of pictures from that time. And actually, I got to know my husband, my future husband, on that trip. We look at photos now and go, wow, we were actually on the same trip. We certainly weren't interested in each other at that stage. Um, and all I remember was that he was a 14-year-old boy, and I was more interested in the 16-year-old boys. So there was certainly no romance or whatever, but that's kind of the time that we assume we must have gotten to know each other, because it's the first time we appeared in each other's photographs and so on. So I probably learned a lot about the language during those years. I took it for 5 years during high school, and I did get good grades, but really I don't think anything stood out apart from the trip itself, linguistically, terribly exciting. I did, however, then go on an exchange to Switzerland when I was 17, and that totally turned my life upside down in terms from a linguistic point of view. Back in the day, there was no Facebook, no social media, hardly any internet, and I think there was email, but I didn't have an email address. I remember sending faxes home to my parents occasionally, and certainly writing handwritten letters a lot. So I don't know how people do it these days on exchange when it's so easy to keep in touch with your friends and family, but back then, I would write a handwritten letter and it would take a week to get to New Zealand, and it would take another week for the reply to get back. So I really had a full immersion experience. I lived with a Swiss family, and that was all I had, and I had to make friends and that sort of thing. So a fantastic experience to learn the language. But what was more interesting was that they had so many different languages in their lives. So if in Switzerland, in the German-speaking part anyway, they have Swiss German, which is their local dialect that they speak with each other at home and in informal situations. But in the formal realm, such as at the time at school and on the news and that sort of thing, they spoke standard Swiss Standard German, which is a little bit different, a variant of High German that they might speak in, say, Germany or Austria. So there was at least two languages going on within each kind of individual at the time. Then each village within the Swiss German area had their own version of Swiss German. So they used to talk about, oh, so and so's from that village and so is from that village. And they could tell, they could just hear the difference. Now, at the time, I couldn't, because I was just getting my head around Standard German, let alone the Swiss German, let alone the different varieties of the Swiss German. But not only that, of course, anything that we purchased, like a bottle of milk, would have the word milk written in German and French and Italian and Romansh, because Switzerland has the 4 different national languages. And I'm sure in the other languages they had their own local dialects too. So it just blew my mind at how multilingual these people were, coming from a very monolingual society like New Zealand or America. So I just thought, wow, it's so easy and normal for these people to switch between languages, and they certainly studied the French and that sort of thing at school, and they were very fluent in it. And I traveled around Europe a little bit and heard all the different languages. So that totally opened my eyes, and I got very excited about linguistics then, and made the decision to forget the calculus, forget the statistics. I was going to be a maths teacher. I decided to study linguistics at university because it was so interesting, and I couldn't get enough of it, and I enjoyed it, and I was good at learning it. So that kind of changed the course of my career. So linguistics was it. I also ended up studying a little bit of German, a little bit of Indonesian and Dutch along the way as sort of specific languages, but my major was linguistics. And then for my master's degree, I chose a minority language in Indonesia to study and to help develop and create the dictionary and make a grammar of. So I did a bit of field work there and lived in Jakarta for a year. Which was also an incredibly formative time and very exciting as a young woman. And it just solidified my love for languages at that point. After graduating, what can you do with a linguistics degree except teach? And I enjoy teaching, so I spent about 10 years teaching and researching different languages and best practice language teaching. My specialty ended up being pronunciation, I guess partly because of my own experience with changing pronunciations in my first language and in my second language, which I consider to be German, because I did later on spend some time in Germany and have to change my accent then as well. So I love it. I can't get enough of it. I find it terribly fascinating. But I think ultimately what I most like and most love about learning languages is the fact that when you learn a language, you learn another way of viewing the world. For example, the kami kita distinction in Indonesian. I never had to think like that before I learned Indonesian, but suddenly the language itself made me have to think this way. And it's like that in all languages. They all have unique things that you need to decide or determine or view the world in that way in order to use the vocabulary and the grammar structures that are embedded in the language. So learning languages broadens your worldview. It helps you, get outside of your own monocultural, monolinguistic worldview. If you come from a society like I do, which is extremely monocultural. So that's what I love about languages. I want more people to learn it. I want to help language teachers do a great job and inspire their students. So that's it. That's my journey. That's why Language Fuel exists. I'm really excited to be heading down this journey with you and be able to spend my time thinking about and supporting language teaching and learning. It's been my dream for a while. So I hope you'll join with me and make this a fantastic ride. I'd love to hear any comments or feedback. Feel free to hop onto our main website, www.languagefuel.com, and you'll find all sorts of links there. And I look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you for listening to the Language Fuel podcast. You can navigate to the show notes and links via our homepage at www.languagefuel.com. See you next time.